Good morning, class. Today we will be talking about heat illness and its effect on the body. Okay, some risk factors for heat illness, mainly weather conditions. So we're talking about high temperatures and high humidity as well. Air movement, so whether it's windy or not, as well as radiant heat. So if you are actually playing your game or participating in exercise while in the sun versus in the shade. Also, a risk factor is very high intensity or really long durations of physical activity in the high heat and high humidity, as well as clothing. So this is if someone has to wear very thick clothing for work, such as work overalls, or a lot of clothing and gear for sports, which would be something like football, where you have to wear shoulder pads and helmets. Some personal risk factors are poor physical condition. So this means that your body is not ready for the demands being placed upon it, and that can lead to overheating, which can lead to heat illness. Your age is a factor. As we get older, we're not as apt for dealing with this stress on the body. Degree of acclimatization means that not only are you in shape, but you're actually ready for the demands of your sport and being outside in the sun for long periods of time, being able to get through all the drills or all the miles that you have to run, and how well suited you are for those full practices and full game days. Water consumption is probably the biggest one. If we're not drinking water, we can't sweat and cool our body down. And then the use of alcohol and drugs dehydrates us and helps our body respond improperly to different effects of working out, doing exercise, and also being in the sun for heat illness. Okay, a few ways that the body will handle heat. So we try to keep a constant internal temperature. Our body can actually cool itself by two ways: increasing blood flow to the skin surface. So this is why people appear flushed, usually in their face or in their arms and chest. This is because our body is trying to bring blood flow from the organs up to the skin surface so that it can be cooled effectively. And then the other way that we can visibly see very often is releasing sweat onto the skin surface. This is going to provide moisture on our skin, and then hopefully if there's some wind, it can help cool, and then our sweat will evaporate off our body and cool down our temperature. Okay, so we're going to get into some heat illnesses now. I'm going to start with more mild ones and work up to more severe and deadly issues. Our first one is heat cramps. We've probably all experienced this before. The mechanism or cause of this is usually a fluid and sometimes electrolyte imbalance. So sometimes if you have salt depletion after very long periods of heavy physical exertion, so at the end of a full soccer game or football game, or after running several miles at a cross-country meet, but it usually is from dehydration. Signs and symptoms are painful muscle spasms that usually happen in our larger muscles in our legs, sometimes in our arms and our abdomen as well. Consequences, if we leave these untreated, it can be accompanied by heavy sweating and thirst, and then that can eventually lead to heat exhaustion. So heat cramps on their own aren't going to hurt you too bad, except that you can have underlying conditions as well, such as being dehydrated, which can lead to much more serious conditions. Treatment for this: first and foremost, resting. Try to get into a cool environment, so in the shade. Give fluids and salty foods or some sort of electrolyte solution. Do some mild stretching accompanied with ice massage of the muscle that is spasming. So let's say it's your hamstring. Sit on the ground in a cool place in the shade, stretch out your hamstring, and you can also massage it with some ice. Salt tablets are not recommended due to the risk of overdosing on them, which can increase our sodium levels, which can lead to a lot bigger issues like increasing your blood pressure. So mainly just giving fluids and having them eat some food. Sometimes we can give electrolyte tablets in more severe conditions. This is a lot better than salt tablets. There's no evidence, no research, or no point to give pickle juice, mustard, ketchup, anything like that. All that has in it is salt, and that's kind of an old wives' tale. In severe cases, we will give electrolyte tablets, which will contain sodium, chloride, potassium, magnesium, calcium, all those essential elements for muscle contraction. So again, not giving salt tablets, it can cause high blood pressure, water retention, and long-term effects. Next we have heat syncope. So syncope means fainting. So this basically means fainting due to heat and overheating of the body. The mechanism of this is that our blood will actually pool in our lower extremities in unacclimatized athletes, so athletes that are not quite prepared for the amount of heat or exercise they are doing, especially if they are required to stand or run or exercise in the heat for very long periods of time. Signs and symptoms is going to be a brief loss of consciousness. If untreated, someone who loses consciousness can fall to the ground, so you want to watch for injuries. But once they regain consciousness, the treatment for that is going to be keep them lying down with their feet raised up. Again, try to move them into a cool place if you can, or bring some shade over them like an umbrella or an awning. You want to wet their clothes and have ventilation, so fans on them, provide fluids, and then again, make sure you can move them only if it's safe to a cooler location. Next, we have heat exhaustion. Heat exhaustion comes from a reduction of body water content or blood volume. It's going to occur when you lose really high amounts of water, and that's going to exceed the volume of water that person is taking in while they're exercising or exposed to heat. So basically, the person is sweating a lot, losing a lot of water volume, which decreases our blood volume in the body, and that's because we're not taking in or drinking enough water throughout the day. Mechanism for this is going to be very hot, humid weather, dehydration, mixed with heavy exercise, sometimes that electrolyte imbalance, and then poor physical condition or someone not being acclimatized to the heat can also add to this. Signs and symptoms, the main ones that you want to look for are profuse sweating, so they're going to look very wet, and cold, clammy skin. So their skin actually won't be hot, it'll be cold and clammy, which is what you will see when someone is also suffering from some sort of shock as well. They might have a normal to very slightly elevated body temperature if you do take their temperature. They could appear pale. They will have a weak and rapid pulse when you are checking their pulse. They will have shallow breathing, and then they could also experience other symptoms like nausea, headache, feeling faint, and then they can also collapse from exhaustion and eventually lose consciousness. If this goes untreated, this can rapidly progress to a heat stroke. So we will talk about that next. Treatment for this, you're treating for shock. So first and foremost, lay the person down in a cool place, elevate their legs up, make sure you have ventilation on them like a fan. You want to remove any extra clothing. So if someone is wearing a helmet, shoulder pads, anything that's going to keep them from being able to release their heat, take off their socks, take off, layers of jackets if they were having them when they were running. Fan the victim, sponge with cold packs, give small sips of water if they are conscious, and then you want to refer them to a doctor immediately. Okay, heat stroke is our most severe type of heat illness. All of those other illnesses that we have talked about can eventually end up as heat stroke, but our goal is to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms and catch them early enough so that we can help prevent heat stroke. So this is when your body now starts to fail to regulate your core temperature. So it's not just your face and skin that feels hot and flushed, your actual internal core temperature is starting to rise and it's not stopping. So this is when your sweating actually slows or stops completely, and that's going to prevent the body from being able to release excess heat, which in turn makes it get even warmer. Mechanisms, all the same, really hot, humid weather, dehydration, exercise, direct sun exposure, and sometimes use of alcohol as well because it dehydrates you. So the signs and symptoms for this are very important to recognize. This is when our body stops sweating. So it'll be a little bit bizarre, but their skin could be very dry and they won't have any sweat on it. And very hot skin. So before, with heat exhaustion, we had people that were more cool and clammy and pale. Well, now our body is failing to regulate our body temperature. So it's getting very hot, very red. Someone will have an elevated body temperature, anywhere from 102, 104 degrees, all the way up over 106. They can have flushed or grayish skin. Normally, you will see them flushed and red. They will have a very strong pulse, but it will be very rapid, way too quick. They could have labored breathing, nausea, headache. They could collapse from exhaustion. Lots of times they will complain of chest pains. The person could lose consciousness easily at very high temperatures, and then they could have convulsions or shaking. And if you check their pupils, they could contract initially, but then dilate afterwards, so they won't respond normally. Consequences if left untreated. This is very, very deadly. If this is untreated, it can turn bad very quickly, so it's important to take action immediately. So if you leave this untreated, you will lose consciousness first, you could go into a coma, organ failure, and then eventually death. Treatment for this is a medical emergency. This is not something that we just want to address for a few minutes on our own. We are calling 911 immediately to try to get them transported to the hospital. But in the meantime, it's our job as athletic trainers to cool the victim. We actually cannot transport the athlete until their body temperature has cooled down enough, because a lot of times in the ambulance, they can't cool it down. So what athletic trainers have is we all have ice baths or portable tubs that we have filled up on hot days, especially at our practices like football practice, soccer practice, track, where they're always outside in the sun and they don't get to be indoors with air conditioning. So we have these cold tubs filled up in case of emergency that we can actually place the athlete in. If you don't have that, you can wrap them in something wet, so just like a wet piece of cloth, sheets, towels, put a fan on them. You can also place ice packs in the areas of the picture on the right, which are going to be our 3 main areas to cool our body. So you can see ice packs on the neck, armpits, and groin, and that's because it's going to help cool down the blood the fastest in those areas. If they are conscious, you can have them take a cold shower, but we just use a cold tub with some ice in it at a specific temperature in order to cool the body down very rapidly. This is a good table that's going to show you the differences in signs and symptoms between heat exhaustion and heat stroke. And then this slide is just talking about a few ways to prevent heat illness. Sometimes we catch it too late, and that's when they're already getting into heat exhaustion or heat stroke. But one reason why athletic trainers make sure there are coolers and water bottles filled with water and ice is that we can help prevent these heat illnesses on these very hot days. So someone should be hydrating half a liter at least every half hour, so that's why there are structured water breaks into all practices. Assess the relative danger of the conditions as well as our athletes' personal risk factors. So if they've had heat illness before, if it's the first few weeks of training and they're unacclimatized, if it's very dangerous heat conditions, the athletic trainer is the one that is assessing all that and will make the call if it's safe to practice or not. And then we also have strict acclimatization periods for all sports. So usually it's 7 to 10 or 7 to 14 days when we are slowly building up to the amount of exercise that is, full-time practice or game. And this is going to help improve your sweating response, enhance your skin and blood flow, and improve your cardiovascular function within those few weeks so that you are less exposed to heat and have a less chance of heat illness occurring.